think it was like what I liked about it was it kind of came like as like she like is like, oh yeah, this
That I want to see
now.
what you just said written on paper.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
In a time of oppression, we've been manipulated both in the days of royalty and in the days of politics to give our power away to that system.
Look, I know the supernatural is something that isn't supposed to happen. It does happen.
Honor is something that all men are born with. It cannot be taken from you, nor can it be granted. It must only not be lost.
What power do politicians have? What do they have? They have none. The power that politicians have is the power we bloody give to them every day.
The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it.
God puts us where he wants us.
Welcome to Truth and Shadow, your guide through the supernatural. I am your host, BT, and this is a Shadow Short. Let's navigate the unknown on this brief journey into the depths of mystery. In 1314, when Jacques de Molay, the final Grand Master of the Knights Templar, was led to the pyre on the River Seine in Paris, the flames that rose around him illuminated far more than the destruction of a man or even the fall of an order. Those flames exposed the skeletal framework of a civilization beginning to putrefy beneath its own sacred skin. Officially, de Molay's death was presented as a triumph of justice over corruption, orthodoxy over blasphemy, and royal duty over some kind of hidden evil. Yet beneath the accusations of heresy, idol worship, and secret sacrilege lay an altogether more recognizable pattern, one that would not seem foreign to any modern investigator of power. A deeply indebted state, threatened by a wealthy transnational institution, the use of legal theater, coerced confessions, ecclesiastical pressures, and even carefully orchestrated public spectacle events to eliminate a rival just to consolidate authority. King Philip IV of France did not merely destroy the Templars because they were allegedly guilty of theological crimes. He destroyed them because they had become financially, politically, and symbolically inconvenient. The Templars had evolved from crusading protectors into one of Europe's earliest international financial powers. Their resources, landholdings, banking systems were all independent from any kind of centralized banking system we may see today. And that made them uniquely dangerous to a monarchy seeking greater centralization and power. King Philip understood what many rulers throughout history would later perfect. If one can control the narrative, one can control legitimacy. By casting the Templars as enemies of God, he transformed financial seizure into a moral necessity. The coordinated arrests of Friday, October 13, 1307, the widespread use of torture to extract confessions, the manipulation of inquisitional processes, and the eventual dissolution of the order under papal authority just demonstrated the emergence of a powerful new operational model. Political power had discovered how to merge legal systems, spiritual accusation, and public fear into an apparatus capable of erasing institutions once thought untouchable. In Desmoulins' death, medieval France revealed an early prototype of statecraft built not solely upon military conquest, but upon bureaucratic narrative management. This transformation matters because it marked the beginning of a century in which France would increasingly become defined by overlapping structures of control. Two systems of power, sacred and temporal, both claiming legitimacy, both capable of coercion, and both increasingly vulnerable to corruption. Old medieval synthesis, wherein throne and altar were theoretically united beneath a coherent Christian cosmology, was actually beginning to fracture into something quite a bit more psychologically destabilizing. See, for centuries, Europe's stability had depended not merely on force, but on belief. Belief that divine order and earthly governance reflected one another. That kings ruled by divine sanction, that popes governed spiritual truth, that heresy threatened cosmic order, and any kind of political rebellion would threaten the sacred harmony. But what happened when these institutions began to reveal conflicting motives is the real mystery. Political rebellion threatens sacred harmony and leads to a couple of different questions. What happens when these institutions begin to reveal conflicting motives? What happens when kings manipulate theology for economic gain? And what happens when the church itself appears politically vulnerable? These three questions did not remain abstract, they became civilizational. The relocation of the papacy to Avignon in 1309 deepened this fracture profoundly. When Pope Clement V moved the papal court from Rome to southern France, practical justification centered on instability in Italy. But honestly, the true perception was outweighed by official rationale. Rome was not merely a city, it was the apostolic heart of Latin Christendom, a visible continuity of St. Peter's authority. To remove the papacy from Rome did nothing less than destabilize symbolic geography itself. Avignon, though technically papal territory, existed within the immense political gravity of French influence. And so for nearly 70 years, Europe would witness popes ruling not from the eternal city, but from what many perceived as a court increasingly entangled with secular monarchy. Petrarch's condemnation of Avignon as a kind of Babylonian exile was not rhetorical excess. It reflected a widespread spiritual anxiety that the church had entered as a form of political captivity. This perception was crucial because institutions often retain operational power long after symbolic trust begins to erode. And so the Avignon papacy was administratively effective in many respects. Things like papal taxation was expanded. There were bureaucratic systems strengthened. Ecclesiastical governance became more centralized. Yet this efficiency carried its own danger. The papacy increased to resemble something more like a political monarchy. Things like revenue systems, they expanded. The offices became financially entangled. And kind of a temporal, secular administrative power began to grow. And with each of these developments, the church's moral image risked becoming inseparable from elite political structures. While to ordinary Christians, the shepherd of souls increasingly appeared as another participant in a system of wealth, diplomacy, centralized control. It might not have brought about the collapse of the church, but it was something perhaps a little bit more destabilizing. Visible compromise without visible dissolution. For the medieval populations, this distinction mattered a lot. Europe's worldview was deeply sacramental. Social structures were believed to mirror cosmic assumption, and if sacred institutions appeared more earthly, more politically compromised, then trust in the coherence of reality itself would suffer. Thus, from Desmoulins' execution through Avignon's rise, France and Europe entered an era where spiritual and temporal systems increasingly resembled basically parallel bureaucracies. There were two legal frameworks, two claims to authority, and basically two species, or two wings, if you will, of the same elite form of governance. When stuff like that begins to become apparent, trust, just like today, begins to erode, and then suppression intensifies. The continuing persecution of the Cathars, Waldensians, and many other mystics throughout the early 14th century actually shows how deep institutions like the Catholic Church and France sought to preserve ideological cohesion amidst obvious instability that was growing. The Cathars, or Albigensians, though militarily shattered in previous decades, still remained symbolically dangerous because they represented an alternative cosmology, one outside sanctioned, quote-unquote, ecclesiastical structures. And so the Albigensian Crusade have broken their territorial power, and the continued inquisitional pursuit was designed to seek something deeper, complete eradication. The persecution of Guillaume Bailly-Bast in 1321 is often considered the last prominent Cathar perfectus, actually showed basically that there was a near complete destruction of all organized Cathar spirituality. But his death also revealed something a little bit darker about that era. The institutions increasingly understood that control over belief was fundamental and essential to control the land. Any kind of alternative metaphysic could not be tolerated. Teaching unauthorized transcendence was politically destabilizing. This same pattern appears in the burning of Marguerite Porete in 1310. Porete, a mystic whose work, titled The Mirror of Simple Souls, described radical union with God. And it didn't threaten kingdoms through armies or wealth. You see, this threat was a little bit more subtle. She threatened the established norms of meditation. Her theology suggested forms of divine intimacy that risked reducing institutional necessity. If souls could access God directly, that meant hierarchical structures were unnecessary. Thus, Poret's death was just the beginning of an era where mysticism itself was considered dangerous when it bypasses all official channels. This pattern extended to other lay spiritual movements whose devotion operated at the edges of established institutional oversight. And so what we see emerges as a portrait of medieval France wasn't simply a battleground of kings versus heretics. No, it was a civilization increasingly obsessed with regulating access to God himself. And this obsession would carry enormous psychological consequences. For as sacred and secular elites both expanded systems of control, ordinary populations found themselves living beneath increasingly layered structures of authority. France was becoming a society where power operated through multiple overlapping jurisdictions, each claiming legitimacy, each capable of coercion, and each reinforcing broader systems of hierarchy. So the peasant, the noble, the mystic, the dissenter did not merely live under one order, they lived beneath many. And this complexity caused no end of exhaustion. And before plague or war would devastate Europe physically, this institutional layering was destabilizing the land spiritually. The Great Famine of 1315 through 1317 exposed these vulnerabilities with brutal force. Environmental catastrophe became political revelation as relentless rains destroyed harvests, livestock diseases spread, and food systems collapsed. The massive shortage of grain led to the deaths of uncountless numbers by starvation. But see, the famine doesn't operate inside of a vacuum. No, famines expose pre-existing structures. When the elites often retained disproportionate access to resources, the peasantry suffered most severely. Even during this famine, all the tax burdens remained. And this famine became a little bit more than a natural disaster. It truly revealed systematic fragility. For ordinary people, suffering increasingly existed at the intersection of divine interpretation and institutional failure. Was famine God's judgment? Was it poor governance? Was it some kind of cosmic punishment or elite incompetence? To be honest, I think it was all of that. This duality between political and theocratical exposed Europe's apocalyptic consciousness. Social order no longer seemed guaranteed. Providence itself appeared obscure. And all of this matters profoundly because civilizations under prolonged uncertainty begin developing an archetypical hunger. France was being reshaped into a kingdom where monarchy had weaponized sanctity, and where the papacy appeared politically displaced, where any kind of acts of unauthorized spirituality was systematically eradicated, where famine exposed systematic weaknesses, and where ordinary people increasingly experienced power not as coherent Christian order, but as competing structures of elite governance. The fires that consumed Jacques Desmoulins were not the end of medieval certainty. They were its warning flare. From that moment forward, France increasingly existed within a backdrop of fractured authority, compromised institutions, and growing public anxiety. In such a world, history was not merely descending into chaos. It was preparing, however painfully, for the possibility that salvation might one day emerge not from throne or papal court, but from somewhere less expected. If the first phase of this century's long unraveling exposed institutional corruption, then this phase that we find from the late 14th through the early 15th centuries reveals something even more dangerous. The collapse of universal certainty itself. France, and indeed all of Latin Christendom, entered a period where authority no longer merely appeared compromised. It appeared divided, self-contradictory, and psychologically incapable of restoring coherent order. The systems that had once provided Europe with metaphysical, legal, political continuity just began to resemble competing bureaucracies. The Western Schism that began in 1378 represents one of the most spiritually destabilizing crises of medieval Europe that had ever been faced. For generations, Christians had endured corruption, taxation, inquisitions, war, plague, all while still retaining at least one foundational assumption: that the church remained singular, that it was one, holy, apostolic. The schism shattered all of that. When rival papal claimants emerged, one in Rome, one in Avignon, each asserting authentic succession to St. Peter, this crisis became far more than administrative. It became existential. We got kings, nobles, bishops, and entire nations would align with competing popes. Christendom itself fractured along political lines, left and right. And so they were left with a bunch of questions. Who truly possessed divine authority? Which sacraments carried unquestioned legitimacy? Which decrees reflected heaven? For medieval Europe, visible unity in the church was not optional symbolism. It had been part of the architecture of reality for well over 1,000 years. To witness multiple papal courts condemning one another fractured the faith at a profound psychological level. This sacred authority now mirrored the fractionalism and corruption already evident in secular politics. Europe increasingly became a civilization where even the highest visible claims to truth appeared entangled in bribery, politic, ambition, and the maneuvering of secret elites. France's own internal fractures worsened. The reign of Charles VI, already destabilized by his psychological collapse, became fertile ground for fractional escalation. Two factions, the Armagnac and the Burgundian, increasingly transformed the political competition into some kind of national dismemberment. It didn't unite them. It caused a departure of what was established before. It was to the broader French populace that all of these things were part of a growing pattern, that the elite, the ruling class, functioned less as guardians of order and were more like self-preserving organisms. France was becoming trapped beneath overlapping layers of institutional dysfunction. You had a monarchy weakened by mental instability, the nobility fractured by factions, and a church divided by schism. And the peasantry, aren't we always, burdened by war and heavy taxation? And perhaps most psychologically devastating of all, each structure continued to claim authority and legitimacy while visibly failing. You got to understand that this contradiction is central to understanding the era. The problem wasn't basically an absence of authority. It was a proliferation of compromised authority. The 100 Years' War intensified this exhaustion even further, and by the early 15th century, France was not merely losing battles, it had lost symbolic sovereignty. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 would later epitomize this crisis. But even before its full implications unfolded, the groundwork had been laid by decades of internal instability by elite compromise. Legal frameworks themselves increasingly became tools through which sovereignty could be negotiated, diluted, refined. And understanding that is very critical, because when legitimacy becomes excessively legalistic while losing symbolic trust, populations often perceive law as manipulation and not justice. For peasants and common citizens, life increasingly existed beneath the crushing convergence of multiple failing structures. Taxes rose to support wars that they didn't control. Religious obligations persisted amidst ecclesiastical uncertainty. Noble conflicts devastated lands they inhabited. Disease, famine, mercenary violence, all of that compounded suffering. Generations raised within this instability often develop a heightened openness to extraordinary disruption. Not because they are irrational, but because ordinary systems repeatedly proved insufficient. In other words, France was being conditioned toward the plausibility of heavenly intervention. This phenomenon could be observed repeatedly throughout history. When bureaucratic systems, political elites, and the religious institutions all suffer prolonged legitimate crises, societies began to long not just for reform or reformation, but for restoration. They want fundamental renewal. And so by the early 15th century, France was not simply politically unstable, it was spiritually exhausted. Its people witnessed over a century of accumulating fractures. We had a monarchy willing to destroy sacred institutions of power, the Templars, the Cathars, etc. We had a papacy that was displaced and politically compromised. When mystics would rise, they'd be suppressed. When dissidents would come and speak out against it, they'd be burned. Famine exposed the widespread systematic fragility of the entire food economy. Plague was annihilating entire populations. Madness was destabilizing kingships. The sequence of events matters because civilizations are not just shaped by events, but by compounding psychological narrative. France's narrative had become one of repeated institutional insufficiency. And so we're seeing this archetypical pressure, and that society under prolonged symbolic fragmentation begins yearning for prophets, for figures, events, maybe even movements capable of reasserting coherence. It was a deep spiritual hunger that was growing in the hearts of the common man. That France of the early 15th century increasingly resembled a civilization trapped between systems too corrupt to inspire trust and too deep in the mire and swamp to disappear. It was a kingdom suspended in contradiction, still deeply Christian, torn asunder by ecclesiastical politics. And in such environments, history often reveals a reoccurring truth. When institutional legitimacy erodes beyond certain thresholds, societies become a fertile ground for disruptive forms of meaning, for revolution. Prophetic movements, mystical claims, a growing sacred nationalism. And I'm going to tell you, these phenomena did not emerge and do not emerge randomly. They arise where visible systems have created vacuums of trust. Thus, by the dawn of the 15th century, France had become something more than a struggling kingdom. It had become a psychologically primed civilization. The elites, unfortunately, unbeknownst to them, they prepared it. They got it all ready. Their schemes, and their sinister forces, and their actions to dealing with entities who hate humankind, well, God usually responds with one of his own. And so nearly after a century of fire, famine, plague, schism, political manipulation, institutional fracture, dynastic betrayal, and spiritual exhaustion, France stood not merely as a kingdom in crisis, but a civilization suspended on the edge of metaphysical desperation. From the very flames that consumed Jacques Desmoulins to the divided papacies of Rome and Avignon, from inquisitional purges to the madness of kings, from the fields of starvation to villages hollowed out by plague, every visible structure that once claimed divine or earthly certainty had revealed its limits. Thrones had faltered, councils had fractured, laws had become instruments of power implemented by competing elites. Sacred offices had become temporal. And beneath it all, the common soul of France endured the crushing weight of a question that history has whispered in every darkened age. When the systems of men fail, does heaven still speak? For this was no longer merely political history. It was metaphysical conditioning. It was a spiritual preparation. This was a kingdom being driven century by century toward the terrifying possibility that salvation, if it came at all, might have to emerge not from cathedrals or courts, universities, or noble bloodlines, but from somewhere stranger, more unsettling to the machinations of established power, because history reveals a pattern too consistent to ignore. When corruption calcifies, when institutions fracture, when suffering reaches beyond explanation, humanity begins to look beyond the visible architecture of order. It begins to search the margins, the forests, the visions, the saints. And France, by the early 15th century, had become fertile ground for precisely such an eruption. We're talking about a land primed for miracle, a land where divine interruption no longer seemed absurd, but necessary, a land where prophecy could move armies because bureaucracy had failed to preserve meaning. In the quiet village of Domremy, far from Avignon's politics, far from Parisian executions, far from the legal manipulations of kings and councils, a child was born into this haunted landscape on January 6th, 1412. And after generations of shadow, after a century of fractured powers and exhausted souls, France had reached the threshold where the mystical, nay, the miraculous, no longer belonged solely to legend. On that winter day, beneath the long shadow of a broken age, the girl who would one day make nations ask whether God still intervened in history drew her first breath.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
It's a very strange, funny time where everybody would love to be able to be themselves, but they can't because they must fall in line with the person in front of them. The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it.
You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe.
See, the more at peace you become, the less you tolerate chaos. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you.
God puts us where He wants us.
You want to live that kind of life? I wish you the best. I'll be on the other side somewhere.
Protecting your peace isn't about shutting the world out. It's about keeping your inner world clear enough to hear your own soul.
The truth, nothing more.